Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your Twitter feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Love Marriage.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
So, Whit, you're a mask-wearing white guy.
It's a complicated thing to say to someone these days.
So I guess you're not part of the white backlash.
Yeah. No, I'm not in the Backlash club, which I hope will not be as powerful a club as it has been in the past. Would you still do the podcast with me if I wanted to join the Backlash?
Probably not, or it would be a very, very different show.
I don't think we'd have a show. Really.
No, we probably would not have a show. Do you think the white backlash is real? Do you have like the white inside track on that?
I'm hoping it's not real enough to turn the election, but of course it's a real thing, right? And I do talk to white people who are starting to say things to me like, well, I really wish those protesters hadn't broken those windows, or I really don't like what's going on in Portland, or I don't want to defund the police. The people are saying that is a happening, and not just among Republicans. So yeah, I think it's a danger. Fortunately, however, we have some brilliant guests to talk to us about the past and present of American protest, and yes, white backlash, how real it is, who's pushing it, and what it means, and what kind of attention we should be paying to it. Later in the show, we'll talk to my old friend Russell Banks about this and how this happened in the 60s.
But first, we are happy to be joined by Kaitlyn Greenidge. Her writing has appeared in Vogue, Glamour, The Wall Street Journal, Elle.com, BuzzFeed, Transition Magazine, BQR, The Believer, American Short Fiction, and other publications. She's the recipient of fellowships from the Whiting Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and other places. Her debut novel, We Love You, Charlie Freeman, was one of the New York Times Critics' top 10 books for 2016. She was a contributing editor for Lenny Letter and is currently a contributing writer for the New York Times. Kaitlyn, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So in this episode, we're aiming to unpack the idea of white backlash against the protests following George Floyd's murder. Polls have indicated widespread support for Black Lives Matter and those protests, including among white Americans, which has been a good thing in my view. But it seems like a lot of the so-called backlash we're seeing now is something the Trump administration is definitely trying to gin up white backlash by sending federal troops to Portland, or not agents or whatever they are, talking about protecting monuments at Mount Rushmore and all of his rhetoric around that issue. I wondered if you could talk to us about whether you think that strategy is going to work, and is this silent majority that Trump is talking about when he harkens back to that Nixon phrase still a real thing?
I think that the question of whether or not it will work is sort of like a complicated one, because I think it is already working for a good segment of the white population of our country. Like the latest polls is that 50% of white people still back President Trump, I think was the poll that came out this week. And, we are in the middle of a pandemic. We are seeing unemployment levels that supersede what we had the Depression. We literally are stuck in our houses, and yet 50% of people are still willing to vote for this person again. And I think that really speaks to the fact that those things are working and are part of a very old current and strategy in American culture and American life, and has been a continual call in American culture and American life, since Nat Turner's rebellion, essentially. It's super old, and it is something that we have to be able to recognize the contours of and study the contours of, so that we know when it's entered into the conversation. And then also study the contours of how people resisted and counter-argued against that extremely old argument in the past. And then, the question of a silent majority, I think that the demographic that phrase is invoking exists, but I don't think they've ever been silent. I think they've probably been pretty loud in the chorus of what people think America can or should be. But a key part, at least in that demographic's identity of the last 50 years ago, since the 70s, is this idea that they are somehow on the defensive, that they're somehow oppressed, which is super interesting. Like, I think if there's anything that is different about white supremacy in this moment than it has been in the past in American culture, is that it's very much invested in the idea of whiteness as victimhood, and less sort of whiteness under attack, which are two slightly different things. The older version of white supremacy is whiteness under attack, but whiteness always triumphant. And this version is very much whiteness as a marginalized identity somehow in this country.
That's so interesting. I write mostly about Sri Lanka, where you also have a majority that thinks of itself as victims. And that analogy really had not occurred to me, that we are moving more in that direction. And you recently tweeted about framings of white backlash. And you tweeted about it in a way that forced me to kind of question how I had been thinking about it. And I wondered if we could also kind of begin our conversation with you reading those tweets for us and elaborating a little bit about the paradigms that we've been using, and maybe how we can challenge them.
Sure. So I said the term white backlash frames those actions as inevitable and natural, as if order is being restored after Black liberation goes, quote unquote, too far. And while I agree that white backlash inevitably follows Black freedoms, I do not think there's anything natural or blameless about it. What if the conversation instead was framed as, there's something in the construction of whiteness that demands violent supremacy when even the glimmer of another way of being comes through? And why is that? So I thought a lot about how I was taught sort of about white backlash in history class growing up, even if that was, I don't even think we were allowed to attach the word white to it. I think it was just sort of like backlash in general. And it's often framed, I think, as sort of like, well, what do you expect people to do? Like, this is sort of like a bridge too far. And even for myself, I think I've internalized that. And I think oftentimes when we talk about the history of freedom struggles in the US for Black people, the narrative is often sort of like, and then they did X, and that was like a little bit too much for white people. And the framing of it is sort of like, and isn't that awful, but also sort of like understandable. And so I think we could get a little bit farther if we rethought that impulse. I notice a lot in the summer and spring of sort of seeing so many incidents of police brutality and of white people sort of really cruelly exercising their social supremacy over Black people. Oftentimes into those conversations sort of comes like, well, what was the Black person doing? Did they go a little bit too far and like that was understood? It was clearly the white person was acting in a reasonable way, even though the violence may be a little bit too far or gone too unreasonable, but like, what was the Black person doing to cause it? And I think that's like really embedded. Not only white people ask that question, some Black people ask that question. Many Black people still frame it in that way. That's sort of like the whole place where respectability politics comes from, that if we just acted and did in the very precise confines of what will not threaten the white imagination, which is threatened by anything Blackness does, we wouldn't be treated like this, right? And we're going on like year 250 of this argument that doesn't seem to be true. A statistic that really struck me that I read a few years back was like the Obama administration is the only administration in like the last 40 years, I think, that didn't have any felony convictions come out of anybody working in that administration. That is, unfortunately, that is a remarkable fact of like American political life. So even with a presidency, and Obama, I'm not suggesting was like a wonderful, blameless president and did everything correct, but within the letter of the law, he sure did, apparently. And so even in that instance of the Obamas like so carefully curating their public persona and public approach, for a white audience, for a white middle class swing voter audience, and really catering to that audience in their policy and general stance. Even in that case of like the best good Negro we could ever produce, resulted in Trump. So I just really want to push back on this idea that white backlash is somehow something that can be satiated or stopped in any sort of way, and that it's more a function of the social construct of whiteness and what's within that.
I totally agree with all those things, especially on that tweet that it is, you know, the idea that somehow white backlash is natural is a ridiculous and insane idea, but that is nevertheless embedded in our culture. However, I do want to talk about the election coming up, because I sort of feel like, yes, of course, the everything you're saying about the Obama's and the Trump presidency being a backlash against them, I think is all true and has been well documented in terms of the way his voters vote specifically on racial and white supremacy issues. But I'm not ready to give up this next election. Like, I think there's a chance that Trump doesn't win, you know, and what would that mean if he didn't? I mean, you were citing that Rasmussen poll, but Rasmussen does poll more conservative bent than almost all the other polls. And there have been a number of other polls that have had Biden up quite a bit. Now, I've been listening to like podcast 538 and some other podcasts. 538 is who are saying like they don't think that this white backlash strategy that Trump is doing is going to work, and they think it's bad, and they think he's trying to change the conversation away from this. But what do you think, as somebody who writes about these issues, are they right in saying like, oh, Trump should be pivoting away from this? Or do you think, no, he should go for this, he has a chance to win if he follows this backlash strategy?
I mean, even the idea that it's a strategy, I think, is one that I want to push back on. Like, it's not like a neutral strategy. He is a white supremacist. He believes this. Like, it's not like something that he is necessarily doing to win votes. And Biden trafficked in white backlash stuff as well. So I don't necessarily know that like this is like an either or proposition. I think it is, and like I said, it's an undercurrent of American culture. And how we talk about race and how we talk about whiteness in American culture throughout, so kind of like across the spectrum. It's in the air, which means that we have to sort of like itemize it and sort of talk about it. And I don't know what's going to happen on election day. I think, we're living in a weekend where we just found out that the Postal Service is, being completely torn apart, and states are going to be charged to mail ballots, to mail them in. We're essentially all living under a poll tax now. So I really think we are in a precarious situation where even the polls that we think are sort of telling us even if those polls are 100% accurate, they still can't account for what do you do when a third of people haven't made rent or their mortgage payment and are homeless by November, and so literally cannot vote without an address? What do we do then?
You wrote this amazing and wonderful Times op-ed, which touches on how at the outset the pandemic was thought to maybe be a great equalizer, but that myth was very quickly debunked. I wondered if you could talk about that essay and maybe read to us from it.
Sure. Do you want me to talk about it first or to read from it first?
Whatever feels more comfortable for you.
Yeah, I'll talk about first sort of the impetus of writing it, which is that phrase that my mother says a lot to me, and that I think a lot of parents say to their children, which is "this too shall pass," when you're going through difficult times. And, I see that phrase on church billboards around my town. I see people writing it in their windows sometimes during COVID. And it feels at the start of of our quarantine, rather, I should say. And even right now, some days it feels sort of like a really futile phrase, that it's sort of describing a reality that we don't necessarily live in anymore. Because this too shall pass is assuming on linear time. And one of the really crazy things about this pandemic, like I think other writers have talked about it, Aditya Roy had that beautiful essay about the pandemic being a portal. But one of the things that's really challenging about this time is like at least for me, the pandemic is revealing sort of like how false that idea of linear time and linear progress is. We're living in a summer that is literally echoing the bloody red summer of 1919, 1920, where again, we saw a global pandemic and racial uprising and racial unrest. In many ways, it feels like we're sort of like reliving through that. It feels like we're oftentimes doubling back or losing ground on a lot of things while we're also moving forward. And so the question of like, this too shall pass becomes like almost moot. And so I wanted to sort of write about that and about that question of language and how we intersect with it. And I can read, I guess, a little bit of it if you guys would like. When my mother used to try to convince me of the inevitability of progress, I would sometimes turn to other Black women's voices, the ones people called bitter, angry, or mad. I listened to Nina Simone singing Backlash blues. When I tried to find a job to earn a little cash, all you got to offer is your mean old white backlash. She sang of a world that operated outside of the arithmetic of it gets better. The end of that song is not a belief in progress, but a call for a shift of power. But the world is big, she sings in the next breath, big and bright and round, and it's full of other folks like me who are Black, yellow, beige, and brown. But that doesn't seem to be entirely the right direction in which to point my niece. Righteous rage doesn't fully provide comfort in this time. What we are facing requires more fortitude than quick burning anger. So I look to the Visionaries, the one who tried to see forward. I consider giving my niece a link to Octavia Butler's A Few Rules for Predicting the Future. It is an essay she wrote in Essence magazine 20 years ago, at the dawn of this millennium, when she had already predicted in her own novels the rise of an American president who uses the slogan, "Make America Great Again," and promotes an idealized white nationalist path to a multi-ethnic nation facing unprecedented challenges. In the essay, Ms. Butler says, "Of course, writing novels about the future does not give me any special ability to foretell the future, but it does encourage me to use our past and present behaviors as guides to the kinds of worlds we seem to be creating. The past, for example, is filled with repeating cycles of strength and weakness, wisdom and stupidity, empire and ashes." That maybe is getting closer of what I want to say, though it does not contain anything as reassuring, as placid as "this too shall pass." So I look a bit further and I find these words from Alondra Nelson, a historian, in a recent interview. She said, "The great mythos of American life is the idea that we're always improving, always moving forward. And the great story of science and technology is that it is also always leaping forward to good ends." She notes that we have, quote, "an overinvestment in a progressive narrative, particularly with regards to racial politics, issues of gender, equality, and equity, without sufficient attention to the fact that there's the falling backward as much as there are leaps forward. And that this political moment should be one of humility, of paying attention to looping back, and of acknowledging that sometimes looping back means failure, means going back to the woodshed, means throwing out what we thought we knew and thinking again. It is a hard lesson for a middle schooler. It is a lesson that a majority of adults I know would reject. But I wonder how much further we could get, how much wider we could imagine solutions to this crisis if we set aside the false belief that time always moves us toward a better tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Kaitlyn. I really loved that essay, and I appreciated, I think, a lot about, optimism and its place in our conversations, what it means to have hope, but also the limits of that, but then also the value of looking ahead. And that line at the end with the Nina Simone song about it being not a belief in progress, but a call for a shift of power really got to me. And I think that it's interesting the way that you were talking before about sort of the notion that white backlash is inevitable. And in this way, it's almost like the opposite, like also challenging the notion that progress is inevitable. Like we have to choose all of these things and we have to elect them and be responsible for them and hang on to them and revise ourselves when they don't work. And you were talking a little bit before about how white backlash has changed in the Trump era, and you were making that distinction between whiteness under attack and whiteness under whiteness as victimhood. And that seems like one of those backwards moments that you're kind of pointing to, right? Like that's worse, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is it?
Why do you think it's worse?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's because it's more false. I don't know. I mean, I'm sort of wrestling with this idea as you're saying it. I mean, I'm thinking about it. I mean, the frame that I'm coming from is sort of Sinhala Buddhist majoritarianism in Sri Lanka. And there the narrative is, you know, Sinhala Buddhists have no other place on earth. And we are beleaguered and besieged by a large Tamil population that is both Indian and Sri Lankan, and it's global. And that narrative has become more and more entrenched. And I'm also talking about this in the wake of Sri Lankan elections that I found profoundly dispiriting. Yeah. And so, I mean, I'm thinking of it as worse for those reasons, which maybe that's not right. What do you think?
No, I think it makes the attempt to fight it more difficult, because the claim of victimhood often reduces and like negates any sort of criticism, right, and conversation. Like we oftentimes, I think it's a little bit tricky because you know, when you talk about like, do victims of certain kinds of violence, you know, racial violence, sexual violence often get justice? The answer is like, in the wider scheme of things, no. But in the way that we often talk about victimhood, we sort of make certain types of victimization unassailable. You know, I think the best writer who writes about it probably is Sarah Schulman. She has that really wonderful book, Conflict is Not Abuse, where she talks about this dynamic, where she talks about people in a normal escalation, normal system of conflict, just like the conflict that arises from two people talking and having different desires. The tendency of one of those people to claim victimhood when they are met with someone else who has a different desire than they do. And the reasons why that happens, and who gets supported in claiming that victimhood when that happens. And I think, you know, that book is brilliant. You know, like many people, I think it is like the perfect book for this moment and for this the last election and this election. And I think that claim, because we don't necessarily in the wider cultural conversation have a way to describe that equation, like that dynamic, when a majority population takes on that mantle of victimhood, the larger cultural conversation often becomes around legitimizing that claim, or attempting to understand that claim and not refuting it or attesting it to like this older version of interacting. So like the meta conversation on like, you are claiming victimhood right now, rarely happens, I guess.
Kaitlyn, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure having you on the show, and so looking forward to your second novel also.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. I really had a great time speaking with you guys.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.